Your mechanic just told you your catalytic converter is dead, and he is already reaching for the parts catalog before he has checked a single other component on your exhaust system. And that quote he is about to hand you is going to say something close to $1,800, maybe more, if you are standing in a dealership instead of an independent shop. And the second that number leaves his mouth, you feel your stomach drop because you already know what that money was supposed to go toward this month. Rent, a car payment, groceries, and now it is supposed to go toward a part you cannot even see, sitting underneath a car that failed an emissions test you needed to pass just to keep driving to work on Monday. And the panic sets in because you are standing in a waiting room, being told your only option is a 4-figure repair on a part that gets treated like a locked black box. Nobody is allowed to question. Maybe he mentions a faint rotten egg smell from the tailpipe like it seals the verdict. When that smell shows up on plenty of cars for reasons that have nothing to do with a dead substrate, and he never once pulled up live sensor data before he started writing that estimate. But here is what that mechanic did not do before he wrote that number down. He did not check whether your oxygen sensor is lying to the computer. He did not check whether there is a leak 2 inches from a sensor bung letting outside air skew every single reading downstream. And he did not check whether your car has simply been coated in carbon from short trips that never get the exhaust hot enough to burn clean. Because checking those things takes 15 minutes, and replacing your entire converter takes $1,500 of margin. And that 15 minutes he skipped is the entire business model this video is about to expose. The code sitting on that scanner, P420, catalyst system efficiency below threshold, does not mean your converter is dead. It means the computer compared the oxygen readings before and after the converter and did not like the pattern, and that pattern gets thrown off by things that have nothing to do with a dead converter at all. A failing downstream oxygen sensor being the single most overlooked cause in any shop that skips a real diagnostic, an exhaust leak near a sensor bung being the second most overlooked cause, and a misfire or a leaking injector dumping raw, unburned fuel into your exhaust being a cause that is actually damaging your converter in real time while nobody looks for it. And once you rule those 3 things out, if your car spends most of its life doing short, cold trips around town that never let the converter hit full operating temperature, there is a real, unglamorous, completely legitimate cause sitting underneath all of it. Carbon and soot fouling, coating the surface of that catalyst, so the exhaust gas physically cannot reach the metal doing the actual chemical work, and that is not a fantasy fix. That is a documented, common failure mode, and it is treatable for $8 to $25 with a real catalytic converter cleaner additive poured straight into your tank, not because it dissolves your converter, but because it is formulated to lift carbon and soot deposits off that surface so the gas can make contact again, the same way you would not throw out an entire air filter because it has dust on it when a proper cleaning restores the airflow. This is exactly why the industry does not want you looking underneath the code, because a 15-minute diagnostic that costs you nothing but a can of carburetor cleaner and a bottle of soapy water in a spray bottle is not billable the way a 4-figure parts and labor invoice is. Dealerships and chain service centers are incentivized top to bottom to hand you the replacement quote first because it is the highest margin line item on the entire ticket. Service writers get measured on average repair order value, not on how many dollars they saved you, and the diagnostic step that would have ruled out a cheap sensor or a free leak fix gets skipped every single time because skipping it is what keeps that number high. A converter sale closes in one visit, while a real diagnostic sometimes means telling you the fix is a $30 gasket, and only one of those outcomes shows up as a win on a service manager's monthly report. And if you are tired of being handed the most expensive possible explanation for a check engine light before anyone has actually looked underneath the hood, hit subscribe right now, because every video on this channel exists to hand you the diagnostic step they skipped, not the sales pitch they led with. Here is what is actually happening inside that exhaust system. Your car has at least 2 oxygen sensors relevant to that P420 code, one sitting upstream of the converter and one sitting downstream. The upstream sensor is supposed to swing rapidly between rich and lean as the engine cycles through its normal combustion process, and the downstream sensor is supposed to read a relatively steady voltage once the converter is hot and doing its job, storing and releasing oxygen in a narrow band instead of swinging wildly. When the computer sees that downstream sensor swinging in a pattern that looks too similar to the upstream sensor, it concludes the converter has stopped storing oxygen properly and throws the P420 code. But that downstream sensor can only report what it is actually exposed to if the sensor itself is old, slow, or its heater circuit is failing, it can report a false pattern that has nothing to do with the converter underneath it. If there is a leak in the exhaust between the engine and that sensor, outside air gets pulled in and changes the oxygen reading the sensor sees, mimicking exactly the signature of a failed converter, without the converter being the problem at all. And if a cylinder is misfiring or an injector is leaking, raw unburned fuel gets dumped straight into that exhaust stream, which the downstream sensor also reads as inefficiency, and which over time genuinely does cook and damage the converter from the inside, meaning the misfire is often the real root cause, even in cases where the converter eventually does need replacement. On a smaller number of cars, a worn valve seal or a head gasket letting a small amount of oil or coolant into the combustion chamber does the same kind of slow damage over months, instead of one bad tank, and that one is worth ruling out specifically if you have also noticed oil consumption or a sweet coolant smell. And separate from all of those electrical and mechanical causes sits the physical one, carbon and soot buildup, which happens when a car spends its life in stop-and-go city driving or short trips that never let the exhaust system reach the temperature required to burn that buildup off naturally. The carbon does not damage the platinum, palladium, and rhodium doing the actual catalytic conversion. It just sits on top of it like a film, blocking exhaust gas from making contact with the metal underneath, and this is not rare. Every cold start dumps a slightly richer mixture into the engine to stabilize combustion in the first few seconds. And on a car doing nothing but 3-mile trips to the store, the exhaust system never spends enough time above the temperature where that leftover residue burns itself off naturally, so it keeps accumulating tank after tank, and a technician who actually wants an honest answer will graph the switch counts on both sensors side by side instead of glancing at one code and reaching for a parts catalog, because that graph is what tells the difference between a converter that has genuinely stopped working and a converter that is simply buried under residue it never got hot enough to shed on its own. And a legitimate cleaner additive built around detergent chemistry is designed specifically to lift that surface film so the gas can reach the catalyst again, which is a completely different job than dissolving glass or stripping metal. It is closer to what a strong degreaser does to a dirty stovetop than any kind of aggressive chemical demolition. Now, walk into any parts store and you will find a shelf of catalytic converter cleaners making promises none of them can actually keep. Bottles claiming to reverse converter death, restore a physically cracked substrate, or undo genuine precious metal poisoning from years of burning oil, and every one of those claims is fiction because no bottle poured into a fuel tank can rebuild a cracked ceramic honeycomb or replace platinum that has already been chemically poisoned and rendered inert. What a legitimate cleaner can actually do is address carbon and soot sitting on the surface, nothing more, and the products worth buying are the ones that are honest about that limited scope. Instead of implying they can raise your converter from the dead, watch the label and the ad copy for the specific tells. Anything promising to restore a converter regardless of its condition, anything citing a suspiciously specific percentage of converters that are supposedly not broken at all without saying where that number came from, and anything showing a dramatic before and after emissions printout with no explanation of what was actually wrong with that particular vehicle in the first place, that is marketing built to make you feel like you found a loophole instead of a product built to honestly solve one specific and common problem, because scope honesty is the difference between a product that will actually clear your code and one that is just delaying the exact same $1,800 invoice by a few weeks while draining your wallet $10 at a time. Here is the actual protocol, and it takes less time than the diagnostic fee most shops charge. Just to tell you what you already suspected, start by pulling every code your computer is storing, not just P420, because a pending misfire code or a fuel trim code sitting alongside it changes everything about where the real problem is. Next, with the engine running and fully warmed up, spray soapy water around every exhaust joint, flange, and both oxygen sensor bungs, and watch closely for bubbles, because even a small leak 2 inches from a sensor will throw off the entire reading downstream. A real leak produces a steady stream of small bubbles right at the source the moment the engine is running, not a random bubble here and there from moisture cooking off a hot pipe. So give each spot several seconds before moving on, and if you find that steady stream, that is a gasket or a weld, not a converter, and it is a repair that costs a fraction of what you were quoted. If the exhaust is sealed tight, check your live oxygen sensor data with a scan tool capable of showing it. A healthy upstream sensor should be crossing back and forth across roughly half a volt several times every 10 seconds. and a healthy downstream sensor should sit well above that crossing point and barely move. If instead, the downstream sensor is bouncing anywhere close to the same rhythm as the upstream one, that is the exact signature the code is reacting to, and it can come from the sensor, a leak, or fouling, which is exactly why you check all three instead of assuming. And if the soapy water test leaves you unsure, a shop with a smoke machine can confirm a leak in under 10 minutes for a fraction of what a converter costs, so use that as a tiebreaker before you spend $1 on anything else. And if you cannot access live data, or if that downstream sensor has never once been replaced on a car with real mileage on it, replace it, because it is a fraction of the cost of a converter, and it is a documented cause of this exact code. If the exhaust is sealed and the sensor tests fine or has just been replaced, and your driving pattern is mostly short trips around town, treat the converter for carbon fouling, run a full tank with a reputable cleaner additive mixed in according to the bottle's instructions, then take it on a sustained highway drive at a normal cruising speed for at least 20 minutes to let the system run hot the way it is designed to, and rescan afterward. And here's the part that matters more than any step before it. This protocol treats a fouled converter, a false reading, or a lazy sensor. It does not and cannot fix a converter that is physically cracked, rattling inside its housing, or genuinely worn out from real age and mileage. If you have ruled out the sensor, ruled out every leak, treated for fouling, and that code comes right back within the same tank of gas, that is your actual confirmation. The converter itself is done. And at that point, the honest move is to replace it, because an emissions test in a state that requires one will not accept a temporarily cleared code. It requires the actual problem fixed, and driving around pretending a genuinely dead converter is fine is not a workaround. It is just delaying an inevitable repair. While your car keeps failing a test, it is legally required to pass. So here's the real math nobody at that counter wants you doing out loud. A cleaner additive built to treat fouling runs $8 to $25. A downstream oxygen sensor runs somewhere between $150 and $400 installed. And even both of those combined do not come close to touching the $1,800 to $3,000 quote you were handed for a full replacement you may never have actually needed. The only version of this where you are stuck paying that number is the version where the converter is genuinely cracked or poisoned. And even then, you deserve to know that for a fact, instead of taking one technician's word for it after a 15-second scan, and before any of this leaves your pocket, check one more thing. Almost nobody at the counter volunteers. Most vehicles carry a federal emissions warranty that covers the catalytic converter itself for 8 years, or 80,000 miles. So if your car falls inside that window, the part just quoted to you at $1,800 might legally be the manufacturer's bill to pay and not yours. And that is a 5-minute phone call or a look through your paperwork most shops will simply never bring up on their own. There is a particular kind of satisfaction in handing a service writer your own scan data and watching him realize you already know exactly which 15 minutes he skipped. So before you approve a 4-figure repair on a part you cannot see, run the 15-minute test yourself. And if this just saved you from paying for a part you did not need, or if you know somebody staring at the exact same estimate right now, send them this video before they sign anything.